I'd just like to introduce two further leaders from the Pivotal Labs business here in Sydney, Amjad and David, who will talk to you about some patterns and some approaches to take strangling a monolith. So welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks. Oh, is that the clicker? All right. Hi, everyone. I'm David Julia. I'm the director of Pivotal Labs in Sydney. Everything that Fede mentioned about working with our customers to build software together, build continuous delivery pipelines, and help our customers become great at delivering software, we do that just down the street. So if you're interested in that or talking further after this talk, just come and see us.
Yep. Hi, my name is Amjad. So also work at Pivotal Labs, which we actually help our customers build products anywhere from re-platforming, rewriting to greenfield. And today we want to talk to you about how to kind of go about breaking up a monolith and potential strategies that you may want to look at. So David will go through a real life example where we worked with a company to help them break up that monolith, a real legacy system, to try to modernize that a little bit. And we'll end with some tips and tricks and some strategies for you to think about as you're doing that. So just before we kind of set the tone, I'm going to ad-lib something right now, and David doesn't know I'm going to do this. Why don't everybody get up and do a stretch? Like any stretch that you want, and there's a reason for this, and I'll explain why. Any stretch. Okay, cool. Okay, sit down. So the reason why I've asked you to do that is it kind of tees up really nicely the GIF that I have over there, right? So if you've ever been in a situation where you're trying to work on a legacy system, and every time you introduce a change, something completely different happens that you weren't expecting. It's a bit like that GIF over there, right? And we're going to go through a bit of an example now where we're working on something, and every time we try to make some changes, we just were not getting the expected result.
Great. Awesome. Thanks for that. So how many people here, by show of hands, have legacy systems in their organization, have worked with legacy systems before? OK, that's a lot of people, right? So a lot of this will be very familiar to you. First, I want to talk to you a little bit about the situation of the application that we were tackling, and then I'll tell you a bit about the strategy we employed to change our situation from being that crazy, stretchy GIF into something that's really streamlined, where we knew exactly where we were going. And then Amjad will talk to you about how to actually get started applying some of these things in your organization and some broader principles that you can take home as well. All right, so the scenario. We were working with a very large health insurance company in the US, and they were tasked with extending a core capability, a key component of their application landscape that was currently locked up in a monolithic system. What they wanted to do was, as a business, they wanted to introduce new tiers of networks. So health insurance in the US is incredibly complicated. We'll get into that in a second. But what they wanted to do was introduce a new feature to their products that they could sell to their end customers to remain competitive in the market. So in the US, in health insurance, you have this concept of being an in-network provider or an out-of-network provider. So if I have a certain insurance policy for health insurance, I can go to a certain set of doctors and pay less if they're in my network, and I pay a lot more, astoundingly more, if they're out of my network. But because that's not complicated enough, we wanted to introduce tiered networking. So rather than just having in-network and out-of-network, you would have a gold provider, a silver provider, a platinum provider, a double platinum provider, and you would pay different rates to all of these different providers. And this was actually a competitive feature of plans in the marketplace. This is something that businesses were asking insurance companies to do because the other insurance company down the street was pitching it to them. So to remain competitive and win the business of these large companies, this health insurance provider wanted to introduce this feature. Now, what the main constraint on introducing this was really interesting. Funny enough, in the US, unlike in Australia, if I want to say go get a knee surgery done, I busted up my knee, I need a knee surgery, I have no idea how much I'm going to pay for that procedure until I'm out of the hospital and I got my knee surgery done and I wind up with a bill. Many times this happens to people.
Thank God we're in Australia.
Yeah, seriously. But there are tools to estimate, and these are provided as self-service tools or often tools where you call up and someone in a call center looks up the estimated cost of your procedure. And if the patient, the insured party, actually uses this tool, our customer, this health insurance company, being actually quite a good organization, felt that they had some obligation to be very close to that estimate when they actually hit you with a bill so that you weren't shocked at the end, which often happens. So if I told you, if I'm the insurance company, and I told you that you would pay $1,000 for your knee surgery, but then you wound up with a bill for $10,000, the insurance company would often eat that difference, pay the $9,000 that would come out of their bottom line, and there's real money at stake here. So with the introduction of these new tiered providers, they didn't have any way of doing accurate cost estimates for different procedures at different providers with different tiers. And estimating the cost of a procedure, even without tiering, is complicated in the US. It has to do with, obviously, what doctor you went to. It has to do with how much you've spent in the year. It has to do with what they call them accumulators, different buckets of types of procedures that you can accumulate spend against until this idea of co-insurance kicks in, where you pay a percentage of the cost, but not all of the cost, and then you hit a limit, and then you don't pay any more cost. And to make matters even more complicated, your company, because it knows its employees, likes a certain doctor or a certain medical group, can negotiate specific rates with a specific medical group, and a specific provider at that medical group could work down the street and bill you a different rate. So it's really, really, really complicated. And that's without tiering. All right, so let's look at the situation here. We had a third-party web UI, which was the cost estimation user interface that people would go to and look up knee surgery in Chicago. This was in the US. What providers can I go to? What would the cost be? That in turn talked to a very large monolithic application that in turn talked to a bunch of different source systems to pull together the data it needed to give you an estimate, among other things. Inside of that monolith, wow, that was a big thing. It was the main member-facing web application. So it had all of your billing, your accounts, your user profiles, authentication, secure messaging, a member store where you could redeem points for different contact lenses, things like that. And it also had this SOAP service as a component of the monolith that fueled the third-party liability estimation, cost estimation user interface. So we're going to zero in on just that one today. And that was the target of what we wanted to replace and augment with this new tiered provider functionality. All right, so we looked at the monolith, and most of the people who had programmed that monolith were no longer with the company, had retired or just quit the company. And the code itself, after looking at it, was just a crazy web. There were no automated tests that actually had assertions in them. There were just documentation was littered around, and most of it was very misleading. So we thought, actually, in this case, what we would like to do is strangle that part of the monolith, write a new cost estimation service, a REST-based service, a more modern service and modern technology off to the side, strangle that piece, carve that out of the monolith, and have the user interface speak to our new service instead. That would have two benefits. One, we wouldn't have to deal with the possibility of breaking any other critical functionality in that monolith, and we would wind up with a much cleaner architecture going forward. All right, so our initial approach. We had a co-staff team, so part from Pivotal and part from our customer, as we do in Pivotal Labs. And we had, as a member of that team, in addition to some really great programmers and great designers, we had a product manager from our customer who came from the business, not a product manager by trade, and they were an expert. They really, really knew cost estimation. Like, they were the foremost expert in the whole company on how these calculations were done, what systems different data came from. They were the right person to have. We were feeling really, really good. So our initial approach was to, as I mentioned, strangle that piece of the code base away from the monolith, led by the expert. The expert would help us define user stories centered around specific calculations that were meaningful to the business, that would be intermediate results, that would then roll up into a calculation of cost estimation. And we were chugging along, banging out user stories, continuously delivering them to a staging environment, using our automated pipeline. We were feeling pretty good. But there were some pretty complex flows, and they were starting to create some anxiety in the team. In fact, I remember one day, the product manager came by, and they said, "Oh, it's a rough one." I said, what happened? Well, they were staring at a 6,000-line XML response, as you do when you're replacing legacy systems, and they realized that the relationship between the customer and the insured policy that was documented in this big XML response, they had made some really core key assumptions about the meaning of some of these fields that were completely incorrect. And how is that possible? They were the expert in the company. They knew this, and yet a key set of fields documenting the relationship between the customer and their policy, completely incorrect assumption on how to use those fields. Our results were completely out of whack with respect to the actual correct estimate. This created some anxiety. And we thought to ourselves, what we're doing isn't working. We're not actually making progress, or are we? Are we taking a step forward? Are we taking a step back? We have no idea. How can we move forward when we're not sure that we're not making more fundamentally wrong assumptions? And we thought to ourselves, the strangler pattern overall is great for decomposition. We felt like we had overall the right strategy, but we had no idea what logic to build into our services. That was the key problem. So how do you move forward? That's when we had, thankfully, a very good idea. We had this idea that we call the data-driven strangler. So while the team and I were sitting together, commiserating, venting, and trying to figure out what to do, it struck us that the strangler pattern was part of the equation. That was right. But what we needed to do is to take a data-driven approach so that we could understand if we were actually making progress. So the idea here would be to collect actual production data and get insight into the operation of the system, and use that to then see if our requests and responses match the requests and responses coming out of the legacy system. And then we would be able to track exactly how much progress we were making. Maybe we start out matching 10% of the time. Our responses match 10% of the situations that the legacy XML SOAP API would have responded to. And eventually, we would want to get to 100% match rate so that we replaced everything. And then we could add our new tiered functionality on top of that. So how did we implement this? The third-party web UI, we redirected the proxy to point to a new box that we called Project X because we were so excited about our idea it needed a cool name. And Project X started out as a simple logging proxy. It would just take the request from the third-party web UI, the cost estimator UI, and log that, pass the call through to the Monolith's SOAP API, log the response coming back out, and that was it. But what that did, all of a sudden, it was like turning the lights on. We had insight into the system. We knew what was actually going on. What were the most popular kinds of requests? What were the procedures and the fields coming back? How could we actually prioritize now based on what we actually saw in use in production? Before, it was a complete black box. So this was a major turning point for us. But we didn't want to stop there. What we then wanted to do was take it a step further. And a week later, after implementing this logging proxy, we extended it to then call into our new calculation module as well, our new cost estimation API as well. So what it would do was it would call into the monolithic API, it would call into our calculation module, and it would always return the result from the legacy API. So there was absolutely no risk that we were going to mess up the cost estimate and give the customer an incorrect result. But what it allowed us to do, it allowed our product managers, it allowed our developers to actually run analyses, write some SQL, query our database, and start to run analyses on are we matching, in what scenarios are we matching, and are we not matching? What fields are causing our results to be incorrect? And we had a huge amount of insight to then prioritize what we worked on. So not only did we know what to do next, we could figure out exactly where the source of our errors or our mismatches were. And this was great. But then we decided the next week to take it a step further. The product manager started to complain, oh, I'm writing so much SQL, I really don't want to be doing this. And we thought, well, actually, you shouldn't be. This is not a task that requires human creativity. Let's automate it, as one does. So we actually then extended it a step further, and rather than just logging both requests and responses from each system, we then compared the results in an automated way, and we would log any deltas. We would log if it matched, and we would log if it did not match and what the mismatch was. So all of a sudden, now we were able to have a match rate that was automatically calculated for us. This gave us a real-time feedback loop. We'd push a change, we'd pump the production traffic through it, we'd let it sit for a few hours. This was a very large insurance company, so 15 million members doing estimates all the time. So a few hours was all we needed to get statistically significant data pumping through that system. And this was amazing. We knew if we were making progress. We knew if we had slipped back. We knew how much progress we were making. And not only that, we could show it to the business. We could put a graph up saying, we started week over week. We started matching 0%. Then we got to 14%, 22%, et cetera, et cetera. We finished the main flows, and wow, it jumped up to 66%. We're feeling good. And over time, we could track and show progress. And this was amazing because no longer were project managers or business stakeholders saying, are you red and green on your status, and what milestones, and what's your velocity? All that went out the window. They don't care about that because this is the number they care about. How close are we? How close are we to our goal? What that then let us do was take a business lens to this. What's the actual financial impact of going to production? Take the percent of error cases. When do we mismatch? How many times do we mismatch? Times the average dollar difference per mismatch, times the average number of requests per day. And that gives you your possible financial impact per day of going to production with your new system, turning the old one off. And so as we got more comfortable, we started to turn off the path to the old system for some really stable use cases. And when we wanted to make the case to go to production, it was really, really simple. When the possible financial impact per day is less than the cost to maintain the legacy system, no brainer, turn it off. And we had data to show this. So we shut it down. We shut down the legacy calculation path. We only called into our new one, and we had successfully strangled a very large chunk, a very complex chunk of the monolith. And then we celebrated. All right. So now I'll turn it over to Amjad to talk about some patterns and how to get started.
Sure, thanks. So we thought this was actually going to be very topical for you because over the course of the work that we've been doing here and talking to a number of organizations within Australia, we tend to come across a lot of legacy systems, a lot of monoliths, a lot of systems over 20 years old, 30 years old, a lot of complex logic that's in there, and it kind of makes a lot of sense to start actually tackling them, particularly when they're mission critical. So, you know, we thought some of this stuff might resonate with the audience over here. And what I wanted to do was spend some time to actually talk to you about the different strategies that you could employ to get control again. So that, going back to that first GIF when it was all over the place, get control again. So David talked about a data-driven strangler approach, right? There are other options. That isn't the silver bullet. That isn't the thing that I want you guys to take away from the talk today and go and try that. There are other approaches, and here they are. So you could actually rewrite your system from scratch, and we'll go into each one of these and deep dive and talk to you about when to actually choose any particular option here. Another one could be actually buying something off the shelf. You may actually do nothing, and that is a valid option, and we'll talk about that in a sec. Containerize, that comes up a hell of a lot here. So we could containerize. You could migrate to a PaaS, or you could try that strangler pattern. So let's go into some of these. I'm going to start off with the build-buy decision. So it's not quite in order, but there's a reason for that. So let's talk a bit about the build-buy. So first of all, if it's core to your business, you really should be building it. If you're buying it, what's stopping your competitors from buying it? How's that any differentiator? So first of all, ask yourself, is it core to your business? And the other one to think about is if you do buy something, do you overly need to customize what you're buying in order to get it to do what you want it to do? So a real good case in point is anybody here use Salesforce in a way that you shouldn't be using it? That's a really good example of over-customization, right? And we see that quite a bit. Typically here, the best option would be a mix of the two, right? So build your differentiating parts, the things that are core to your business, and buy the things that are not really core to your business, but would actually save you some time. So a really good example maybe is we built with one of our clients a real estate valuation tool. And you build all the logic, all the core flows, but you wouldn't really necessarily build a PDF generation software, right? You kind of buy that, and I see the guys laughing. Yeah, exactly, right? Save you some time. All right, so when to do nothing. And this is actually a valid option. So if you don't really have any delivery pressures, if the system that you're thinking about touching is kind of stable, and you've got your OpEx under control, maybe you just want to keep the lights on, right? Maybe you don't want to invest in this further. So just leave it. Don't touch it. You don't have to jump on some bandwagon to implement some new technology. Don't need to do that if you really figure out if there's ROI for you to do this. Next one, containerize it. So got to be careful what I say here because we talked a lot about containers. Containers are great, love them. But it's not a solution for your problem here, right? If you want to stick your legacy systems in a container, okay, it might help you a little bit as a kind of like a stepping stone to a PaaS, but it's not really going to solve your problems that we kind of addressed here, like it's slow to augment it, you got that painful deployment process, the testing, the business rules, the logic behind it, you still don't understand those things just because it's in a container. So think about that one. It isn't necessarily the solution for you in this particular example. All right. So migrating to a PaaS. So I think I'm going to refer to Sachin's slide here, where he had a whole bunch of our customers like T-Mobile and all the benefits that moving to a PaaS brings. So if you look at those 5 S's, so if you really are thinking about improving your speed, reducing your costs, I think there are really a number of really good examples that Sachin gave where that really might make sense for you. So now let's address the rewrite. So if you are thinking of rewriting, there are certain things that you should think about. So I'd highly recommend rewriting if the original product that you had is just not right. It's not making traction in the market. Maybe you're losing business. It's not actually serving that job that you've identified very well. You're losing customers. If your market share is going down, it's actually quite different to the original intent of that product. Maybe you should think about a rewrite as well. And that happens, okay? You can start off with something, but due to changes in the environment and market and various other competitive pressures, you may actually need to rethink that product. And a rewrite may make sense. Now, the other one here is, if again, this is core to your business, it's an important product, it's serving customers, but there's some technology that's holding you back. So think of mainframe here, or think of, maybe you've overly customized some off-the-shelf products, and you're not able to release quickly enough. You're not able to, as Fede mentioned, experiment and reduce those feedback loops and test things out and be able to deploy on a Friday or whenever you want to. If that's holding you back, maybe then you should start thinking of a rewrite as well. Okay? And when you're doing that, it's actually an opportunity for you to redefine your business processes around that new system. Because you may be doing some funky stuff that kind of may have made sense at the time because of the systems that you had and they were constraints. But right now, maybe you can rethink that with a fresh view. All right, so the strangler pattern. We talked quite a bunch about that. So yeah, look, I think use that when you want to really reduce risk. If you've got something that, you've got a big user base, you've got some traction there, and it's making you some money, use that as a means to reduce risk and start to remove any complexity that you have in that old system, right? It's an opportunity for you to really start to produce something a little bit more modern, but also enable you to start delivering faster. So there's a bit of payback for you when you do that. Okay, so a few things that we want you to take away from this. This does sound quite technical, and maybe it is, but you should also think about your end user and your customer when you're doing this, right? So if you're approaching a strangulation, you're approaching a rewrite, think about the users and customers that you're actually serving. This is an opportunity for you to serve for that job, that need, in a far better way. And you can actually then start to remove complexity. You can remove steps that are in place for your users and customers to achieve those goals. And don't do this as a like for like, right? Because the more complexity you reduce, the easier it will be for you to maintain in the long run. The other thing is, if you think about products in general, there's an 80-20 rule, right? 80% of your users are using only 20% of your functionality. It kind of happens. You end up designing for all of these different things. Just get rid of the stuff that you find that nobody's using. So take a very data-driven approach to figuring out what makes sense and remove those as you're going along. And lastly, do this iteratively, because approaching a strangulation or a rewrite is a big undertaking. Where you can find ways that you can get some value deployed and into production quickly, it makes a lot of sense to be able to do that. Why? Because as we know, you may not have funding to do the whole initiative, right? Sometimes funding gets pulled. So you want to be able to show that progress and be able to get some value into production and into hands of users very quickly. All right, so how do you do this in your organization? All right, so nice segue there. Yes, definitely start small, right? So I talked about you may actually lose funding, but a way to start showing some value and getting things into production can actually then start to show the rest of the business, rest of your organization, that this is actually a very valuable investment and there's a lot of return on that, and you may be able to extend that funding. The other one is really quantify your outcomes. So try to establish a baseline. The most important thing here is to be able to show that you're delivering that value. So how do you show that if you don't have some of that data in the first place? So I think in David's example, it's really nice. They could actually start to show an exact match or close to an exact match. They actually ended up being better than the old system, so they never got to 100%. They got to like 98. But if you can start to identify some metrics and quantify outcomes, that's really going to help you to gain support. And lastly, very much so, gain that momentum, start to get things released as quickly as possible. And if all of that seems really difficult for you, a very shameless plug, we can actually help you as well. So definitely
come to us. Yes.
All right. Last slide. Before lunch, because I know that everybody's hungry, please do contact us if any of that sounded interesting. And there's some photos there of our labs. We are on Clarence Street.
And come talk to us. We'll be around for the rest of the day. So if you have a legacy system or a new product that you want to launch and you just want to bounce ideas off of us, have a chat with us. We're around. We're pretty friendly. Just, tap us on the shoulder. Come chat.
Thank you.